Great. Okay. So I think we'll begin. We've given people a few minutes to come in after lunch. But first of all, hello. I'm Jonathan Gray, and I'm very happy to be here for my first week at the Institute for Policy Research as a new prize fellow, an incoming prize fellow, working exactly around this topic. So I'm very excited to be helping to organise this panel as part of this conference. And the research agenda that I'm hoping to establish at Bath is essentially around the politics of public information. And I'm particularly interested in how data infrastructures can be viewed as socio-technical systems which create the conditions of possibility for different ways of understanding social phenomenon, for different dynamics of collective behaviour, and facilitating, supporting different kinds of social worlds, or what we might consider as data worlds. And these range from the making of national statistical indicators to transactional big data derived from digital platforms and services. So while a lot of public information policy focuses on how data moves around in society and how it is shared as a resource from which various forms of value can be extracted, or focus on how it's protected and controlled in order to afford privacy to different data subjects. The agenda that I'm kind of keen to introduce here at the University of Bath is also looking at the politics of the making and reshaping of public data infrastructures, and how these infrastructures give rise to different forms and conceptions of evidence, how they format issues in different ways, and how this in turn informs public policy making processes. So this afternoon, the panel that will be presenting to you will go through some exciting cross-section of research which studies and experiments with the different practices of engaging with public data infrastructures, from new tools and methods to new genres of data work to new forms of presentation, design and engagement. So we'll be looking at not just the use of data in policy making, but also new practices to shape the making of data and the opening up of new forms of public space for deliberation and participation around data infrastructures, and in turn the implications of these new practices on public policy making. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Liliana Bunurgu, who is a doctoral researcher at the universities of Groningen and Ghent, research associate at the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam, and research fellow at the Tau Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. So she has a professional background in setting up numerous data journalism initiatives and training programs, including through her role as program lead at the European Journalism Centre, and she's going to be talking a bit about her research on data work and data infrastructures in journalism.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the first time that I will be speaking about this work to a policy audience, so I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes. So in response to the theme of this panel, which Jonathan just introduced, I would like to focus on the role of journalism in reshaping public information systems, so a new actor in this space. And more specifically, I would like to focus on data journalism as one of the new collective practices that do not just exploit the output of information systems, but engage in challenging the techniques of measurement and monitoring embedded in the systems in order to reshape what becomes evidence. So for those who are not familiar with the concept of data journalism, it refers to practices articulated around the mobilization of data sets for journalistic storytelling and investigations. Yeah, so contra what we might be used to, recurring cultural references to journalists' fear of numbers and statistics, I would like to suggest that we need to develop new ways to study and understand data practices in journalism and their potential role in challenging and remaking data infrastructures, which is why I think that it is relevant to speak about journalism in a conference dedicated to policy making. And also challenging and remaking the forms of evidence based on these infrastructures. And following a number of researchers, Jennifer Gabrice, Helen Pritchard, and others, while these data practices developed in journalism might not directly meet regulatory and policy standards for data collection and analysis, they nevertheless play an important role and should be taken into account as multiplying and enriching vocabularies and forms of political action around official data collection processes. So before I move into presenting some of the ways in which data journalism takes up the issue of making and remaking data infrastructures, which is what the theme of this panel is, I would like to take a couple of minutes to introduce the notion of data publics. This is a notion that I found very useful when studying data practices more generally. Yeah, so I borrowed this notion from the work of Evelyn Rupert at Goldsmiths, and I developed it more in a piece with several other colleagues, Carolyn Gerlitz and Jonathan Gray. In this piece, we conceive of data publics as societal, economic, academic, and governmental stakeholders that articulate their practices around the mobilization of data sets. And following this definition, data journalists would be an example of such a data public, and so would be computational sociologists, data scientists, data activists, and so on. We propose to think of these publics as emerging in relation to data infrastructures as dynamic formations that have specific needs, objectives, practices, as well as analytical capacities and resources. Yeah, so in this view, data publics operate within the tension between data infrastructures being inscribed with particular analytical rationales and biases, while also being multivalent. In other words, being open to multiple use scenarios. Yeah, so an example of this multivalence of data infrastructures would be if we take the example of digital platforms such as Twitter or Facebook, whose data is being used for a lot of different purposes. So we see them being used for marketing analytics, for apps development, for surveillance, but also for social research. Yeah, so for this reason, working with these infrastructures or activating data becomes a process of devising methods and tactics to achieve an alignment between infrastructures and the data public's own objectives, needs, and methods. Yeah, so having briefly introduced this more conceptual notion of data publics, I will now move on to illustrating two ways in which data journalism takes up this issue of making and remaking data infrastructures, which is essential to policy making, in this process of aligning information systems to its own needs. And the first aspect pertains to tactics devised to intervene, challenge, and remake these information systems, while the second one pertains to an ecology of tools that emerges from this data work. So the first point on initiatives and tactics to intervene in data infrastructures is something that I developed together with colleagues in these two articles. And the second point on data ecologies is something developed with Tommaso, who is also on this panel, in a different paper on data tool ecologies. But let's start with the first point on tactics designed by journalists to intervene in data infrastructures. And I would like to briefly focus on two tactics and illustrate them with two projects. The first tactic that we studied was what is called making your own data. So while scraping data sets from the web and getting data from governments are more established sourcing methods in journalism, they are used a lot. In recent years, producing one's own databases has also become a powerful tactic to advocate for changes in official data collection practices. And indeed, in the past years, we've seen several journalism projects setting up their own data production operations, and particularly prominent have been death counts. Yeah, so there are multiple journalism projects that count everything from drone strikes and their casualties to migrant and mine worker deaths, as well as killings by the police. And I will give just one example of such a project designed by journalists as a counting operation. So this is the Guardian's The Counted project. In June 2015, The Guardian US launched a large-scale counting operation to more comprehensively record cases of killings by the police in the US. And this project was initiated as a response to systematic underreporting of homicides by law enforcement officials. And as well as in response to the absence of solid mechanisms to record and aggregate such incidents at federal level. So this project is ongoing, and to identify these instances of what is called arrest-related deaths, it collects and cross-references data from a number of different sources. This includes police reports, witness statements, media reports, and other media and civil society organization counting initiatives. And particularly important, what was particularly successful in this project were reader submissions via email and the submission form, as well as Twitter monitoring and the use of Google Alerts. This is a case of a successful project in the sense that it has successfully intervened in official data collection around police killings, in that a new federal program has been set up to better document these arrest-related deaths. And the methodology of this new program is very similar to the Guardian's own methodology, and the project itself is being used as one of the data sources. Moving on to briefly illustrating the second tactic, which is called reverse engineering. So reverse engineering comes from the computing world and is essentially used to describe a process of identifying how a system works and reproducing it. So this can be done, for example, in the case of software by disassembling, or hardware by disassembling it and analyzing its components, or by deducing how it works from analyzing its outputs. And I'll give just one example of an award-winning investigation into double voter detection systems in the US. So double voter detection systems are software programs aimed to address voter fraud by detecting individuals who voted twice in different states in the same election. To disclose and denounce the methodological biases inscribed in these systems, a group of journalists requested their outputs via Freedom of Information requests, and performed a number of calculations on them in order to understand how does the system identify, how does the system decide who is a double voter. And what the investigation found was that the program was classifying an individual as a double voter on the basis of first name and last name matches only, ignoring things like middle names, social security numbers, and so on. And due to this methodology, a number of minorities, Afro-American, Hispanic, and Asian, were disproportionately threatened with having their names removed from voter rolls, as it was found that they tended to share common surnames. Yeah, and this is again a case of a successful project, which managed to mobilize legal and advocacy groups for voter and minority rights to engage with contesting the methodologies employed in these voting fraud detection systems. Yeah, and in the context of journalism, this type of tactic of investigating how algorithms works is called algorithmic accountability reporting. So it's a new type of investigation. The second aspect of recomposing data infrastructures that I would like to highlight pertains to the software devices and tools that emerge from this data infrastructure work. So this consists of everything from tools for the collection, preparation, analysis, and visualization or narrativization of data sets that are being used in journalism, but also outside it. Yeah, and an example of such a data tool created in the context of journalism for data work is D3. So this is a very popular, widely used open source visualization library for the web, which is maybe surprisingly developed by a member of the New York Times graphics team. But this project is extremely successful. It's the 4th most popular open source project on GitHub, which is a open source code sharing platform, alongside software produced by actors that have a lot more resources to invest in software development than journalists, such as digital platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and so on. Yeah, so in a different paper with Tommaso, we mapped these tool ecologies for the valorization of data in journalism to understand who is active in the production of the software, as well as what do these devices do? What is their role in the production of journalistic evidence, if you will. We used this code sharing platform, GitHub, as well as an expert list of over 100 organizations involved in the production of journalism code to trace these software devices and who makes them. And yeah, so for those less familiar with programming, GitHub is a large online hosting service for code repositories, software code repositories, and also one of the largest collections of open source software. Yeah, so this means that when we encounter these devices, these tools, we encounter them as source code, so as the instructions behind the software program, which is why we refer to them as journalism code. So what we found in this exercise was that GitHub organizes, so this code sharing platform organizes a predominantly Anglo-American journalism code space where collaboration follows geographical boundaries. And what you see here is a network map of journalism code repositories connected by the contributors which they share. Yeah, so the majority of the map, actually the bottom part, is the US code space, and the top, like slightly disconnected, is the UK journalism code space. And there are a few actors that hold this space together. So there are a number of trans-institutional actors and initiatives, such as coalitions of journalists and news organizations, transnational grassroots journalism and technology organizations, programmer journalism advocates. So there is such a thing called programmer journalism, and collaborative data and tooling projects. And there are also software robots or bots that work across repositories and contribute to holding this space together. This space also reveals new kinds of non-traditional journalism actors to occupy important positions. So everything from civic technology to open government and open data advocacy, as well as web development, social media, and data visualization. And maybe what was particularly interesting were the positions of open data, open government, and civic technology actors in this space. So while open data and open government actors in the US, some of you may be familiar with the Sunlight Foundation, a transparency NGO, or Code for America, were very central to the US journalism code space and mediated between different news organizations. In the UK, organizations of similar nature, such as you might be familiar with the Open Data Institute, they were significantly more marginal, less involved in this journalism code space. So in terms of what does this software actually do in journalism? So how do you do journalism with the software code? And in terms of what this code does, we found that collaboration around the production of this code tends to revolve particularly around tools for data extraction. And to give one example, this is an application by the California Civic Data Coalition, a group of journalists across the US. And this application helps journalists to download campaign finance and lobbying activity data for the state of California. And it makes it accessible in an easy-to-use format that allows them to do further calculations and operations on it. What is also interesting about this code is that it illustrates the many different ways in which journalists source their data. So this includes developing and using devices such as APIs to interface. So APIs are application programming interfaces, which help to interface with existing sources of data. So this is an example of the Sunlight Foundation's Congress API, which interfaces with multiple data sources to extract information about the people and work of Congress and to package it in easy-to-use formats. Another sourcing method is whistleblower submission systems. So these are also a really important data sourcing method for journalists. These are systems that enable journalists to securely accept leaked documents and data. And this is one such example, SecureDrop, which is created by the late information activist Aaron Swartz and maintained by the Freedom of Press Foundation. Another example is notification systems, which allow journalists to be alerted to changes in websites or web files that they are interested in following, as well as survey tools to support the crowdsourcing of data. This was also a highly collaborated repository, as well as scrapers. So scrapers are pieces of software that automate the collection of online data. And one example of this would be, again, the Sunlight Foundation's open state scrapers, which allow the extraction of US legislative data from multiple sources. And maybe one last point that we can make about the software code that supports the making of journalism with data. So a more general point that we can make about this journalism code pertains to what we call its mediating capacity. So we can say that journalism code may be understood as a series of alignments performed between the capacities and analytical inscriptions embedded in existing databases and data tools on the one hand, and the needs and value requirements of journalism and civil society publics on the other. And in the interest of time, I will move straight to the conclusions. So to conclude, what are the implications of all this? And I would like to make two final points. So as far as the official data infrastructures or information systems are concerned, I hope that this brief presentation showed us that we should not think of them as fixed entities, but as dynamic and distributed accomplishments, which assemble multiple publics, analytical practices, and software tools. So it is important to pay attention not just to how they are made, but also what publics they mobilize and to what ends. And as far as the role of journalism is concerned, I hope that this showed how journalism may play a role in the wider data ecology, not just by telling stories with data, but also by developing tactics, and maybe more importantly, by developing tactics to reconfigure data infrastructures, as well as software tools that can be used to valorize data. Yeah, so it is important to reflect how these tactics and tools, and this may be a point for discussion for later, how these tactics and tools may be seen as enriching vocabularies and grammars of political action around official information systems. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I think we'll save, maybe we'll save questions for the end, unless anyone has any sort of pressing questions now, and move on to the next speaker, who is Tommaso Venturini, who is co-founder of the Media Lab at Sciences Po in Paris, lecturer at the Digital Humanities Department at King's College in London, and who has several other new forthcoming engagements, which I'll leave you to ask him about in person. And he's going to talk to us about sprinting with data as a means to engaging different publics around data infrastructures. So Tommaso, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So this presentation is about a very practical way of organizing research that we experiment in a project that we'll talk to you about. But it's also about how to implement an idea that is very important to the tradition from which I come from, which is the tradition of actor network theory STS, Social Science and Technology Studies, according to which the researcher should, to use the word of Isabel Stenger, think in the presence of their victim. So create their own project and do their own investigation at the very presence of the people, the subjects, or people, or human or other types of actors that are the very objects of their study. To use the words of Bruno Latour, the critic is not one who debunks, but the one who assembles. The critic is not the one who lifts the rugs from under the feet of naive believers, but the one who offers the participants an arena in which to gather. So the political objective of Acton Utilitarian part of the STS is to create this space where people, actors of science and technology can gather together and discuss and work out their disagreement. That's why it is so important to think in the presence of the victim, to do one's research in the presence of the people that are affected by the research. The problem is that it's not always easy to understand who's the victim. So this is, as you can recognize this is Sidney Lumet, Murder on the Orient Express, and in all the crime films and crime books, you have a moment where the killer is revealed. All the people are assembled together, and the detective sort of explain his train of thought and sort of reveal who is the murderer in the story. The problem with Acton FOT, and the problem with controversy mapping, the particular type of Acton FOT they've been working on, is that it is not always easy to understand who are the object or subjects of our study. And that was particularly difficult in this project called the Maps, Electronic Maps to Assist Public Science, which I led from 2011 to 2014. It was a big project financed by the European Union. Last 3 years, it was financed for 1.5 million euros. So it was a big project with 6 different research centers from all around Europe. And it was about mapping the controversy about climate change adaptation. So investigating and visualizing all the different issues, all the different positions, all the different actors engaged about the problem of adapting to global warming, basically, and to the changing environment in which we live. The problem with climate change adaptation is that it's as it has been called, a wicked problem. So it's so complicated that it's very difficult to unravel it, to untangle all the complex network of actors and issues that constitute this. Adaptation is difficult for 4 different reasons. The first one is that climate adaptation is delayed. It happens in the future. In this sense, it's very different from the 2 previous controversies about climate change. The controversy about the existence of climate change, which sort of is turned to the present, to detecting the rising temperature or the first impact that we can observe, or the controversy about the attribution to anthropogenic causes, which is turned to the past, and how we have been emitting greenhouse gases in the last decades. The controversy about adaptation is about what will happen in the future, in a future that is still relatively vague. We don't know exactly what will happen. So there's a first set of disagreement connected to climate change adaptation, which are connected to how bad climate change will be, which is not sure yet. We know it's going to be bad, but not how much. How fast it will unfold, and where it will strike first. So which will be the first impact that we will have to deal with. The second reason why climate adaptation is complicated and why it's difficult to know who the victim is that climate adaptation is dispersed. If climate change is something that happens globally, because greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere and create a layer that is more or less equal everywhere in the world, the impacts of climate change will be very different according to the different countries. And there are still plenty of huge uncertainties about how to scale down our model. So we know that the temperature of the planet will probably increase of about 2 to 3 to 4 degrees, but we don't know exactly what impact that will mean. It depends a lot on the different part of the country. And so even knowing sort of who's going to be affected, who's going to be affected the most is a complicated matter. What you see here in this image is probably the map or the diagram that has traveled the most from our project. And it sort of triangulates 3 different vulnerability indexes. So there are different institutions that are compiling index, that are ranking countries according to their vulnerability. And so we triangulated them to see which countries were very vulnerable according to the 3 rankings, or very climate resilience according to them. And we discovered, some way surprisingly, that there are huge divergences about these three indexes. And while there are a few countries that are very vulnerable according to the 3 of them, the red countries in Africa, for example, there are also plenty of others, which I don't know if you can see them. They're striped. They have stripes. They're called with stripes. For example, most of North and South America. They have this color because to indicate that they are considered among the most vulnerable countries according to one of the index, and amongst one of the least vulnerable countries according to the other. So the second set of this agreement is about which region will be more vulnerable, which sector will be more effective, and which arrangement should we take to make our society more resistant or resilient to climate change. The third reason why climate change adaptation is complicated is that it's diffuse. In some way, the question of how we adapt to climate change is connected to a whole set of other questions according to the sector in which you ask that question. So how do we adapt for railways, for example? Well, it sort of raises a lot of questions about the management of railways in general, for example. And so adaptation is never separated from a lot of other societal debates. And here, for example, you see this is a string graph about adaptation in Bangladesh, and it links the different projects that have been already carried out or started in Bangladesh to the different sectors that they concern. And you can find very different things, from water to infrastructure to education to et cetera, et cetera. So a third set of this agreement concerns the boundaries of adaptation and how global warming will impact the different natural and social equilibrium in which we live, and whether the action that we take for adaptation we're just sort of changing the label of stuff that we would have done anyway, or if they constitute new and additional action. And of course, whether the previous problem and issue have been taken into account. And the last reason why adaptation is a complex societal problem is that it's very opportunistic. Because more and more resources have been now challenged, or some people say challenged, some people say re-leveled under the label of adaptation. But in any case, as you see in this image, the sum of money that are engaged for climate change adaptation are rising in a very, very important way. And so, of course, the very discourse about adaptation became opportunistic, because there's plenty of actors that either try to relabel their own sort of political objective under the name of climate change to make them more silent, or they do the opposite. They sort of hide, conceal climate change politics under politics that they push with other reason. And so what we discovered when we started the EMAPS project is that not only we had bad maps, we had bad visualization of what the climate change adaptation debate was, but we didn't know who we could ask for help. And when you do mapping or controversy mapping, like we try to do in this project, you always sort of trapped in this dilemma. At the beginning, you have bad maps because you're starting to study your object, and you're not in contact with the people that can help you. But you know which people can help you. You would need a good map to identify who are the actors of the controversy. So basically, you're lost because you're isolated, and you're isolated because you're lost. And so the very nice and clean and simple workflow that we imagined at the beginning of the project, that's sort of the workflow that I put in the project proposal for the European Union. And as you see, it's a very, very, sort of clean and easily understandable and sort of standard workflow for a research project. You first have data collection, then you go to the analysis, then you go to the representation or visualization, and then you go to the dissemination. But we discovered in the very beginning of the project that actually things were more complicated. And in particular, that our publics and the experts that should help us in the project could not only be activated or mobilized at the end of the project. That would have been too late. We would have discovered at the end of the project that the maps that we had realized were sort of irrelevant for those people. And so we actually sort of tried to redesign the research project of EMAPs so that we have alpha users, as we call them, present in all the phases, from the hypothesis to the first sketching or drafting of the maps, to the actual data collection, to the analysis, and then to the publication. And actually, we discovered, little by little, that even this workflow was too simple. And then we should rather go into something much more complex, like this spiral here, where we sort of start with bad maps and we start reaching out for the wrong people, and then little by little we improve our maps and we sort of get in touch with better experts, with better users. And by iterating this research protocol, we eventually produce fairly good maps, decent map, and we finally get in touch with the right people that could lead us. If you compare this type of iterative research protocol with the one that I showed before, so this one, the linear classic one, you might realize that the difference between the two does resemble a lot to the difference between two other types of workflow that have been popularized in program development. And so basically, what you see up there this is called water flow method, where you go from analyze, plan, design, build, test, and deploy in a sort of linear way to what is called agile programming. That is sort of that is a way of working in which you iterate through the development of a series of prototypes, each one drawing on the previous one and each one improving the result of the previous one. And so once we realized that what we wanted to do resembled much more to the agile programming than to the waterfall workflow, we sort of look out for the actual ways of organizing work that have been used in the community of agile programming. And of course, we encountered hackathons and barcamp. I don't know if you ever heard about this kind of meetings. There are usually short meetings lasting 2 or 3 days, in which a group of programmers are convened in a place. Here you see an image of an hackathon, the TechCrunch hackathon in the United States, and they work in a very intensive way on various programming problems for a few days, and at the end, they sort of deliver some results. And we asked ourselves how we could learn from hackathons and barcamp to create a research format that would fit controversy mapping and more generally digital method research. And working with Liliana in the EMAPS project, we created this idea of data sprint. which sort of take three things from the hackathons at Barcamp. The first one is the heterogeneity of the actors involved. You need to have, you could say, a full stack of competencies, so all the skills that you need to collect, analyze, visualize, and interpret and disseminate data, present at the same time in the same place during the data sprint. The effort to convince the participant physically, which we discovered was very important, particularly working on digital methods, particularly working on digital traces. We found out that it was really crucial to be in the same place, surprisingly enough. Despite all the technologies that are available for distant working, when you work on digital data, you get much better result if you actually convene physically. And the third element was the sort of quick and dirt approach, or as it's called in the development community, design to cost, which sort of makes sure that at the end of the sprint, we had some result that could be delivered. But we also changed three things in our hackathons. The first is that compared to hackathon and Barcamp's data sprint are preceded by a long work of preparation. Generally in hackathon or Barcamp, people just sort of meet up. They sometimes might have some ideas of what to do, but generally speaking, even the very objective of the hackathon at Barcamp is not decided in advance, it's decided during the hackathon itself. Whereas in data sprint, since we wanted to achieve more, we prepared the sprint a lot in advance, like by creating sort of making sure, for example, that we invited all the good people, that the working teams were already formed, that the broad research questions were already chosen. And then the second, data sprints are generally a bit longer and more structured than hackathons at Barcamp. Hackathons at Barcamp generally use 2 or 3 days. Sprints last 5 days, 5 full days, and they are more structured in the sense that, once again, how the sprint will develop, sort of when people will be split into groups, when they will all work together, when there will be presentation, is decided in advance. So that there's a sort of rhythm that has to be followed during the data sprint. And then the third thing, the third difference is after the sprint, because the sprint generally in hackathons at Barcamp, when they're finished, people sort of go home, and what's done is done. It's published somewhere in GitHub or in some repositories, but it's not. There's no one that necessarily follow up. That's not the case in data sprint. In data sprint, there's always a work of follow-up to make sure that the results of the sprint are then finalized and sort of packaged in a way that can easily travel to society. So just to show you what it looked like, this animation of the first data sprint that we organized in Paris. So you can see this is Sciences Po Paris, with a lot of people working in their own. There was even a cat participating in the sprint. This is Oxford, not far from here. The second sprint that we organized in the project, and this is Milan. If I still have 2 or 3 minutes, yeah. Okay, so I will conclude by giving a very quick list of what and who is in a data sprint, and I will point you to a paper where you can find more detail about it. So a data sprint always starts from posing the research questions, so deciding which are the research questions that will be sort of investigating during the sprint. In part that is done in advance, but in part that's also done during the sprint, because that's the moment where the experts are physically present together with the participant of the sprint. The second very important operation is to decide how this research question will be operationalized. Because as we discovered, there are always some very interesting research questions that are asked by the expert that are actually impossible to operationalize, given the data and given the digital techniques that are at hand, or given the skills sometimes of the participant of the sprint. So the second phase, very important, is deciding which of the research questions could be operationalized, and so which sort of sub-question can be asked. The third step, which is the one that takes the longest time, is the collection and preparation of the data set. That's why, when it's possible, it's better to do that in advance, beforehand. However, we also discovered, to some extent, it's always necessary to collect some extra data during the sprint, or to sort of re-treat them, to re-clean them, to re-wrangle them, in order to make them relevant to the research question as defined during the sprint. Then the fourth phase is writing and adapting the code. Adapting because data sprint is not always about creating new code, but often about reusing code that we developed for other projects to fit the need of the sprint. And then design the data visualization or the data interface for in case data tools are developed. And then the sixth and I don't know if it's the most important, but it's so this one step that should not be forgotten, is to reflect reflexively about how what has been achieved during the sprint can be used can be fed back into the controversy that has been studied, or into the societal discussion from which the data sprint has started. And so how knowledge can be co-produced with the victims or the users of the data and the visualization and the tools that we have developed. And finally, that's a list of the sort of different types of role that should be present in a data sprint. You need to have, as I said before, issue expert of alpha users. You need to be, you have to be in the presence of your victims. You have to invite the people that will actually use your work. They have to be present and they have to be capable to express themselves and to sort of raise their objection if they disagree. Then, of course, you need developers. You need sort of data scientists, people that can crunch data and code. You need very important project managers in each of the team groups that we had in the sprints. As you've seen in the image, data sprint we organized gathered something between 30 and 40 people, but then they were subdivided in a smaller group of 5 to 6 people. And each group had a project manager, and that's very important because data sprint need to achieve a lot in a relatively short amount of time, 5 days. And so you need to make sure that you have people that are devoted to managing the work of the group, making sure that all the documentation is properly done, making sure that the data circulates among the different groups, etc., etc. Then, of course, you need designer. That's very important because at least in the version that we developed for controversy mapping, being able not only to produce code or data, but to produce visualizations, so diagrams, images, or sometimes static, sometimes dynamic images that can be then that can travel more easily in society is very important. And finally, the sprint organizer, which is of course a crucial role, and not only during the sprint but also before and after the sprint, to prepare the sprint and then to finalize the result. It was very quick, but here you have 3 papers that I've been writing or co-writing about sprint. All of them are available on my website or on my ResearchGate profile or my own website. There. So feel free to have a look if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sabine Niederer, who is founder of the Citizen Data Lab, research director of the School of Design and Communication at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, and researcher at the Digital Methods Initiative at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And she'll be talking about interventions to reclaim data with the Citizen Data Lab, including through participatory design sessions, visualization initiatives, and digital methods for mapping cities. So Sabine, as soon as you're ready, the floor is yours.
I'm ready. Let's see if the projection is as well. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for introducing me, for inviting me here. I'm the surprise guest. I'm not on the menu, but I'm happy to be here to introduce some of the work we're doing. As Jonathan said, I'm going to focus on telling you a little bit about participatory data practices at the Citizen Data Lab, which is based at the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam. where we work with the Amsterdam municipality, but also neighborhood initiatives, bottom-up organizations, and, well, let's see. So, roughly speaking, I will be addressing three, let's say, strands in our program. The first one is really centered around creating maps, and we've talked about that already a little bit, in order to navigate issues of the city. The second one is looking at how people organize themselves with tools within the city, so neighborhood initiatives especially. And the third one is looking at a little bit more experimental data visualizations for, let's say, data awareness or data literacy, as we call it. So the Mapping the City project has two approaches, and now I know what I should have written on the slide. It's scraping data and making data, as Liliana put it much more straightforwardly. So the first one looks at the visualization of available data, online data. And I want to show you a little bit of this with an example. And this is the example of the Knowledge Mile. Now, the Knowledge Mile is an initiative in the city of Amsterdam, basically taking the area around the campuses of the two large universities of the city, well, two of the four large universities of the city of Amsterdam, which are centering their campuses, meaning that currently about 40,000 students enter and leave this area on a daily basis, and in 4 years it will be double the amount. So it's a huge stressing factor or strain on this part of the city, and some initiators thought, let's maybe try to also make this a positive thing, that we have a lot of capacity of researchers in this and students in this area, and also let's look at who else is here. It's not only these students. So for those of you who know the city of Amsterdam, it's from the Newmarkt, which is in the center of the city, where you have the Rembrandt house, all the way to the Amstel station, where you have the Rembrandt Tower. So it's from Rembrandt House to Rembrandt Tower. They've thought of this. But it basically cuts through a lot of different neighborhoods and a lot of different areas. We have these areas, districts, and neighborhoods in Amsterdam. It's very confusing, but it cuts through a lot of them. And we knew, because it created a lot of hurdles for us to start mapping issues there. So basically, we had our demarcation of the area. It was done by others, and we wanted to look at how we could actually use online data first to create some kind of baseline of what was there. And there was the ambition to make a, let's say, tightly knit community of this area, and we wanted to basically have a baseline of what it was when the project started, which is 2 years ago. So we use digital methods. We've heard the term before. It's basically methods attuned to the web, medium-specific methods to collect and analyze online data and content for social and cultural research. It's not so much only to find out how Twitter works, but it's about what Twitter can tell us about a specific topic. So we wanted to create maps and then present them to local stakeholders. It wasn't just for us, it was actually looking at who we thought the data publics should be. And but we did want to, in this case, make the maps first and then present them. Now, there has been a lot of criticism of mapping that maybe you're aware of. It can be construed as very reductionist. You create this little story, this very boiled down narrative of a super complex issue. Well, Tommaso has done important work there. You've seen the eMaps project, which is an atlas for a reason. There's not one mother map that can be created of a huge complex issue. And that's also the way we like to work, looking at trying to make as many maps as possible to make legible a complex issue, rather than using it really as a tool of navigation, not so much as a reductionist narrative. So the maps we made were and are layer after layer of information that can be found online or that we have collected together with locals, as I'll tell you later. And we're creating this atlas of layers of information and an atlas of a single street. Now, the reason that that is interesting to some of the people involved in the project is that it pushes specific research methods to a street level, which on the web is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily make sense to start geolocating it down to a street level. That's not even possible in most cases. But we wanted to, on the one hand, have this methodological, difficulty, and also looking at whether we could have that fine-grained view of a specific area, and then see what it could mean to different publics. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. I don't have time to go into all the details, but 3 of the layers that you see here, we wanted to look at what are most important places. Now, we asked some of the people who are based in that street, and it goes from famous museums like the Hermitage has an Amsterdam location there, to huge newspapers, news agencies. A lot of municipal municipal offices are there, and we just wanted to, and architects, well, what have we? It's a very broad collection of types of organizations. And we asked them what would be important, in your case, what is an important place? What would important mean? Well, said, well, we want to know who's actually the most important, as in most recognized by others, like, or most iconic, like who has the best buildings, what the architects brought in, or most acknowledged that people say, I've been there. So those were all things that we could work with, looking at data sets. Now I want to look at one of them, which was locating the one that was already most prominent amongst the organizations based there. So that was looking, first of all, starting from a Chamber of Commerce database. An absolute nightmare. I don't know what the data looks like here, but it's really bad in the Netherlands because people register their company once and then never update. So it has old names, no websites, or some old websites. It was a disaster. But that's where we started, looking at who's actually located there. And we also wanted to include web data, and web data doesn't always work with street names, so we needed to create a bounding box within certain APIs, like programming interfaces. We had to say, okay, within this area of the map, so it's wider than only the streets that we selected, but that's the way it worked. So then we queried Google, looking for images, which images are very prominent, and we also looked at hyperlinks. So what we did from the data from the Chamber of Commerce, first we had to update it, but then we looked at who is actually linking to each other already. Hyperlinks on their websites, simple as that. Because maybe there were some collaborations already that we didn't know of. And we started, so after plotting the companies on this map, we started looking at a hyperlink map. Now, for those of you familiar with, you can't see the lines, so you see dots. It's actually arrows. Doesn't matter so much. This is what they usually look like, and we wanted to plot it onto a street map. And meaning we had to go back to our file with the addresses of all the URLs and then plotted it onto the street map. Now this was really fun because you could see that specific sectors would always remain linking within their own sector. So the news was linking to the news, museums to museums, schools to schools. It was very much compartmentalized. Not a huge surprise. But the winner, let's say, the organization most linked to was the city of Amsterdam, amsterdam.nl is their beautiful URL, but they never linked back, like not once. So when presenting that to locals, we invited all the organizations we had found for a session, we said, okay. And organizations, I'm saying, but also houses are registered. If they have an organization, Vereniging van Eigenaren, I'm not sure, but when the owners have organized themselves, they're also in the Chamber of Commerce. So it's actually not only huge companies or anything. So when we presented that first, the municipality official was super happy that they were the winner, but when we said, but you never link back, it's like, oh, sorry. Oh. Yeah, I guess we don't. So this was more of a conversation starter for us, trying to look at what are we looking at now and asking what would you like it to look like. And that opened us up to a different way of mapping, not only taking data that was available, so here you see 3 layers, you can look them up, I'll show the URL later. And we wanted to also collectively map specific priorities of things to work on. So what we found, very brief to reiterate, was that the data was really bad, especially Chamber of Commerce data. We needed to double check everything. The fact that it cut through different districts, in our case, was a nightmare because we wanted to ask the municipality for the base layer, the map. But it wasn't possible because it was owned by different different offices, because it was different neighborhoods. So it was this Kafkaesque nightmare of asking the official who was about the benches in that district and having to ask, yeah, but you can't have the benches in that district on it because I don't own that part of the map. Crazy. It also led to the formation of a coalition in this case. So the knowledge mile was already a concept coined by some parties who were settling there. And then it led to a coalition, and now 54 organizations are actually working together in a lot of projects. This not because of these maps, but these maps were a nice base, well, let's say baseline. So we just redid it, and it looks a bit different now. So a second way of mapping the city that we've been working on is having a participatory mapping and also interpreting the results together. So I guess this is, we also work in data sprints, but sometimes the map looks a lot messier when you just use the same map as the other ones, and we roll it out, and then people start annotating it. So this is just to show you what it can look like. This was the starting point of a gathering of 30 initiatives looking at greening the city. And this can go from rainproofing the city, a topic of interest in the Netherlands, as I'm sure it's here as well, by the way, to people specializing in vertical gardening and all these kinds of new initiatives. So this is one way of doing it, inviting all the experts, in this case 30 organizations working on this topic, putting them in the same room and asking them to plot what's happening onto the map and then discussing it. Or other ways are working with tools, and we developed a couple of tools in which, in this case for mobile phone, people can plot specific topics onto a map, a geomap in this case. So here we work with specific or researchers in very specific fields. So the research questions do not come from us per se, they come from experts in the field. And the expert can be somebody, like somebody living somewhere and saying, okay, this is a real problem, I want to organize something around this. Or it can be the municipality, or it can be a specific organization. So we've worked with this tool, it's called Mapping Amsterdam now. Here it was still called Measuring Amsterdam, where we develop a mobile app. You go into the city and you plot specific issues onto your map during a sprint, later to be discussed collectively. Now, the first time we organized this, half of the room was filled with government officials. They loved it. They were like, this is the answer to all our problems. Now we know what's happening, what everybody's talking about. We don't have to fiddle with Twitter anymore. This is the discussion right there on the street. So here you actually see one government official with one of the researchers looking at how this could actually work for those parties. What we have noticed is that it only works if you have a very specific topic, a lot of prep work, like Tommaso also said, where you really prepare what the variables can be, and that you have a specific moment that makes sense for the participants to actually come and show up and spend a lot of time on doing this, going outside with people you don't know, and invest this time in it. So we've done. I'm going to skip that because it takes too much time. So we've done this, for instance, with in a neighborhood called Slotermeer, difficult neighborhood in Amsterdam, in the sense that it has very low literacy and a lot of issues in health, in the sense of not human health but neighborhood health. There's this whole area, as I'm sure you know much more about than I do, of city health. And it's not only about how epidemics spread in a city, but also about factors of a healthy neighborhood. It should be clean, you should be able to buy decent food. Women in the streets are a very good sign. Elderly people in the streets are a very good sign of a healthy and happy neighborhood. So what we did was, during invited by health ambassadors in this district, because that's how bad it is, they have city health ambassadors in this neighborhood. We attuned the tool and the visualization, especially because it's for people who cannot read the Dutch language or other languages either. So we had to have a very strong visual language. During a health festival that they organized, we had this sprint and invited people to go out and plot problems and also opportunities for the health of their neighborhood, improving it. So a lot of people, as you can see here, started plotting trash, which is definitely a big problem there. And you could see it. We had to then visualize it. This was a struggle for the designers, because they had to think of a way in which they also didn't reduce the data into one graphic. They had to actually show every data point. In the end, was the one that worked the best. So what they did was, here you see a few strange things. This is then all the data from one person, for instance. You can see that it's not necessarily maybe the cleanest data, or what does Jennifer Gabri says this word, it's good enough data, or just good enough data. But what you see here is also annoyance or nuisance data. People are plotting the darn trash bag onto the map over and over again. So you also get, of course, the people involved who think this is a hot topic. But it was a very good exercise in thinking about how to adapt the method and the tool and the visualization for a specific situation. And we have further developed this tool. It was very hard to use, it was also very narrow to use. It was used to report problems, basically, on the spot. And we noticed that there was an interest in this tool from very different fields. Also, for instance, more from the idea of photo elicitation, like what are your visual associations with the idea of a healthy neighborhood? You could also open it up like that. It doesn't all have to be, this is bad and this is good and I'm here and this is bad. So what we did was, this was the second version, including images. People could take a photo, was already much better. And now it's this fancy tool called Snap This, or that's actually the version that's now being used the most. And you can just download it for free. And we use it for sprints that have a visual component as well. So it's used to collaboratively create a photo map of either a specific area or of a specific topic, or both. And then you can, it's also not only like and dislike each other's photos, there's a whole range of emotions you can apply. So that's one strand. Going to speed up a little bit. What I would like to mention is another project where we studied bottom-up initiatives in Amsterdam. And tried to understand what they were organizing themselves around. Like, what were the issues that were at the heart of this thriving set of initiatives. On the first mapping we did, there were 50, but later we found there were 100 bottom-up initiatives in the city of Amsterdam that have actually sort of a lifespan. And what we wanted to do was look at, so what's at the heart, and we found that even organizations that maybe started because of poor air quality later really started looking at the city or the neighborhood itself. So the neighborhood itself became the issue or the topic. And that is something we will continue to study, but it also led to a specific side project or spin-off, which was the creation of a specific toolkit for these neighborhood initiatives. Because what we noticed was that everybody was developing basically the same platform, and some people were really good at it, and others were really bad at it because of the technical skills and demands. And you need to have, if you're lucky enough to have a web designer in your neighborhood, then it looked great, and otherwise it didn't. And a lot of the components were the same. And there was this group that was really advanced. These are some of the maps, which was Hallo Eiburg. Now, Eiburg is this new, let's say, new island in Amsterdam. And they have a very organized community living there. A lot of people have organized their own neighborhoods, literally, in deciding which shops, in deciding where they should come, really looking at the, also the urban planning part. And they have a very strong platform. So the person who developed that platform opened it up and made it available for others. So that became a whole cooperative, a co-op. And now there is this co-op of neighborhood initiatives in Amsterdam, which is great. So they together now further develop these tools. And one of the things that they've developed is a widget for their platform, which pulls in government data. So the municipality has these open data sets, as everybody does, but nobody uses them because they're really unattractive, either difficult to use spreadsheets or, hard to find geomaps. So what they did was they created this plugin or this widget for that specific platform, in which when developing neighborhood plans, you can also look at the facts, is what they said they wanted to. They want to look at some facts and figures when prioritizing issues, because sometimes they feel as if there's a specific problem, but they also felt that it would be better also when addressing the government when they had the actual facts in hand. So finally, the data literacy project, like I said, has a more open or experimental visual approach to the topic of data. And here we work together with the municipality, but also the Amsterdam Light Festival, which is this annual event, in creating with designers and students from various disciplines these light objects that visualize specific data. So this Amsterdam Sphere was called Visualized the Mood of Amsterdam according to Twitter analysis. And the citizens was a group of 5, cylinders, let's say, who would talk to each other, reading out Twitter discussions about the city of Amsterdam. So those are other interfaces that are, we think are a contribution to also thinking about new visual languages to these topics. And for those of you who want to get creative after this, we have a specific call out right now where we are trying to do the same, rethinking visual languages for the deep web and cryptography, things we all know are important, but we could use a little bit more than just the iceberg metaphor. So I want to thank you very much.